Everyone right now is talking about the cost of living, but there's another side to that coin, which is how much you earn, and are you earning enough in 2025? The first thing we should really discuss is what do they mean by average and how it can be misleading. The number you'll hear very often cited as the average is the mean. That is just all the data in the data set divided by the number of people in that set. Now, on the face of it, this can seem to be relatively sensible, but it has one key drawback. But let me explain with an example. Let's say you have 50 people sitting in a pub in the UK. And on average, they earn £30,000, calculated using the mean. And then this woman walks in. This is Denise Coates. She is routinely the most highly paid CEO in the UK. She runs Bet365 and last year was paid £221 million. She is our 51st person to walk into the pub. What is the average salary of everyone in the pub now? £4.4 million. And I think this really serves to outline why the mean has some fundamental flaws. And that's because it has this sensitivity to outliers, that the addition of a single person into our admittedly small sample size can make a massive difference to the overall average. So how do we get around this problem? Well, that gives us the median. And for the most part, this is going to be the variable that we'll use for the rest of the video because it's way more representative and isn't prone to these large swings. So how do we calculate the median? The median takes all the data in the dataset ordered lowest to highest. And the median is the number exactly in the middle, 50% beneath it, 50% above it. So you can straight away see how the median is a much more accurate measure. So that's the first real takeaway from the video is when someone tells you the average, you really need to understand what kind of average are they talking about. And there was also this point, which I think summarizes it quite nicely in this Forbes article. This data is a blunt instrument of overall earnings. Wages vary wildly depending on a range of factors such as your age, where you live in the country, and whether you're in the public or private sector and the industry you work in. So with the next part of the video, what is the average salary in the UK? So in 2025, the mean salary in the UK was £35,830, and the mean salary for all full-time workers was £42,110. So what we can obviously see here is the difference between everyone who's working, and then the second number we have just those people who work full-time. I think this also highlights another really important point we should look at when it comes to wage data, which is you've got not just the difference between the mean and the median, but you've also got with earnings, without earnings, with overtime, without overtime, weekly wages, average annual wages. So there are so many ways to measure what can just be such a simple statistic or a very simple outcome. But we've talked about how the mean isn't great. So what does the median look like for the UK? So the median annual salary for workers in the UK for 2025 is £34,963. That increases to £37,856 for full-time workers. And so we can already see that the mean is slightly higher. If we think back to our old pal Denise in the pub, that's exactly the reason why. So for the time being, we'll carry on using the median because it's better. But for me personally, I don't even really think this is the most interesting part. For me, the most interesting part is when you dive into this data and you start to look at the income percentiles. This can really help to tell you where your salary fits into a much broader national picture. So in the UK in 2025, you're in the bottom 10% of the country if you earn less than £9,660 a year. To be in the 30th percentile or the bottom 30, you need to make less than £22,763. If you're the median or slap bang in the middle, as we've just mentioned, the average salary is £34,963. And I think this is really where things start to get interesting. If I was to ask you how much do you need to earn to be in the top 10%, what might you say? Well, according to this ONS data, to be in the top 10% in the UK, you need to earn £72,115. And what would you say for the top 5%? To be in the top 5% of earners, you need to make £87,012 per year. And this is the really interesting one. How much do you think you would have to make in order to be in the top 1% of earners in the country? So according to this ONS data, to be in the top 1%, you need to be making a total of £173,952 a year. Next, we're going to look at age. As we've mentioned, looking at the average, even if we look at the median compared to the mean, does have its limitations. Because no matter whether you're using the mean or the median, there are other important variables at play. Another one straight off the bat is your age. If you're comparing the salaries of someone who's fresh out of university to someone who's been in the workforce for 50 years, then obviously they're going to have different salaries, and that age is going to play an important factor. So let's look at the median salary in the UK broken down by age. So for 18 to 21, it's around £17,284. For 22 to 29, it's £24,600. For 30 to 39, it's £30,865. For 40 to 49, it's £33,477. For 50 to 59, it's £31,358. And for 60 plus, it's £27,508. But again, there's another really interesting aspect to this data that I want to add. which is this column just here. So if you include the high earner salary for each of these age brackets, that's someone who makes 10% or more for that age bracket, I think it also highlights a really interesting point. People might have accumulated assets and so therefore don't need the money as much. You'll also have people who have given up work entirely and they rely either on the state pension or they rely on their private pension as well. Some people will just have fewer outgoings, and so, again, they don't need the money as much. But as we've talked about, your age isn't the only factor. It also turns out that where you work can have a really big impact on your salary. Take a look at this graph here. We can see that the median salary in London has a big outweigh when compared to the rest of the country. And as you move down to the southeast, you still have that London-centric effect, meaning that people who often live in the southeast may well work in London. And then you gradually work down to the northwest and all the way up to the northeast. Now, you might chalk this up to a few different things. The cost of living in some of these areas is cheaper. London will typically host high margin goods like financial services, which will attract higher wages. That can be another contributing factor. But I think there's another really important point which I think indicates a much more ingrained and systemic problem when it comes to some of these income inequalities. Take a look at this study here. One of the primary findings in this study is that the overall lifetime income of a person, irrespective of pretty much every other category or outcome, relies on two things: your parents' income and your postcode. And I think this highlights a really important point, that even if you are born into an area that is naturally more affluent and where income is typically higher, that has an inevitable filter down effect to people's kids. And I think to some degree, we can see this in the data that we're looking at when you start to look at the regional disparities. I think this inevitably leads us on to another interesting thing to talk about, which is what's driving some of this wage growth. Wage growth in the UK has been not as terrible as it has been for the last 10 or 15 years. Still not great, and we still lag behind many other countries, but we are doing slightly better there when it comes to wage growth. So what's really driving this wage growth? One of the main driving factors has obviously been high inflation in 2022 onwards. This has meant that people have had to raise wages in order to attract and retain their workers. The second reason is that there's been quite a tight labour market. Again, employers have had to raise wages in order to retain their best workers. We've got the post-2020 economic recovery. Whilst obviously the economy took a real battering in 2020 and 2021, we have seen a reasonably sharp improvement in the overall economy, unfortunately seeing some of the economic weakness start to shine through. And fourth, there are also some government policies that have gone some way to improving people's living standards. Specifically, the increase in the national living wage by 9.7% and some of the public sector pay deals that were struck reasonably early on in the Labour government. I think the last thing I really want to talk about is what does all this mean for the UK economy? And I'm afraid to say it is kind of a mixed bag. Whilst obviously increased wages are going to be good for people, helping to alleviate some of the financial stresses we've seen for the last 10 or 15 years. The problem is that in most cases, as we've kind of discussed, this has been driven by high inflation. So in terms of real pay increases, it's not necessarily as high as the numbers might initially indicate. Higher wage growth also means that we're likely to see higher interest rates for longer. Now, in all probability, the Bank of England will look at this stronger wage growth and assume that this will lead to inflation spiking again. Now, the fact of the matter is that whilst inflation has dipped slightly lower than initially predicted, it is also expected to increase again towards the end of the year and is expected to stay well above the 2% target for the next couple of years. This is something that they've even cited in their own forecast. So whilst they might be quick to attribute that blame to rising wages, I think it's also fair to say there are plenty of other economic factors at play, which has meant inflation in the UK has stayed higher for longer. We've discussed how real wages have seen some improvements in the last couple of years, but if we expand the time horizon, just take a look at this graph here. This shows average weekly earnings adjusted for CPIH, which is Consumer Price Index plus housing costs. For the most part, one of the main inflationary measures that the Bank of England and policymakers use. But what we can really see is that after inflation, real wages in the UK have gone pretty much nowhere for well over a decade, 15 years conceivably, since the financial crisis. And the truth of the matter is, I don't really see any policies being put forward or on the horizon likely to come into effect that are going to materially change that outcome. So whilst we have had a brief glimmer of good news, in all likelihood, I don't see it sticking around for long. We also have 2 videos on screen where we've talked about the weakness of the UK economy. I would really recommend that you watch them in order to improve your understanding about how the UK economy is really doing. You've been watching Modern Money Talk. Thanks very much for watching. If you like this video, please like and subscribe.